One day I was driving home from work when a severe thunderstorm rolled in. I'm the kind of person who really hates getting wet, so I was driving faster than I probably should have been. As I reached my apartment complex, the rain came down hard. My parking space was far from my apartment, and I knew I'd get soaked if I got out of the car. To avoid that, I decided to wait in the car for the rain to subside. Sitting in the car, I watched the storm rage on and tried to ignore my intense dislike for being wet. After about 20 minutes, something caught my eye near the building. I glanced toward my apartment and saw my door open and two men emerged carrying items that clearly belonged to me. I was stunned and didn't know what to do. I considered confronting them but realized it could be dangerous. Instead, I called the police. When they arrived and arrested the thieves, they took me back to my apartment. The rain had stopped, and the officers told me I was lucky to have stayed in the car. The thieves were found with several knives and were suspected in other robberies and attacks on elderly people in the area. My fear of getting wet might have saved me from something much worse, but I didn't know that this was just the beginning of my troubles. A week later, I found myself caught in another storm while walking to buy pet food and dinner. The weather had changed abruptly from sunny to overcast and black clouds filled the sky. I started heading home quickly, but the rain soon turned into a torrential downpour. There was no nearby shelter, and I hurried as best as I could. Halfway home, thunder crashed so loudly it felt like the sky would split open. I noticed a dark figure by the side of the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't just any person, it was someone in black standing at the roadside. Their face was hidden under a hood, and I couldn't make out any features. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to walk faster, but my legs felt like lead. The thunder grew louder, and the rain poured harder. I saw the figure start to follow me, each step seemingly dragging me further from safety. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door and looked out the window. I saw the figure still standing by the entrance, leaning against the wall, their hood still concealing their face. Even from a distance, I felt the weight of their gaze. That night, I couldn't sleep. I knew that person had been watching me, and the rain had brought with it more than just a storm. It had brought a warning. Every noise outside seemed menacing, and the shadows in the apartment felt alive. The storm had ended, but the fear remained. I would never forget that chilling stare in the dark and the feeling that something far more sinister lurked behind the rain. Every once in a while, I like to go what I call minimalist camping. It's basically the type of camping where you only take what is absolutely necessary to survive. It's definitely not for everyone, but I see it as a fun challenge. Oftentimes, I won't even take a tent, just a tarp to lay on the ground. I did exactly this over one June weekend. I was alone and deep in the forest. This wasn't a typical campsite. I always try to stay away from those. I much prefer a completely uninhabited part of the forest. Usually, I park in some random spot on the side of a forest road, then walk at least a mile and camp where I end up. Or sometimes if I find a small body of water, I'll camp next to that. Anyway, it was the first night of this particular trip. By this point, it was already dark. I was lying next to a fire I made with a small fire starter kit when it started to rain. I didn't have a tent, so I knew I wouldn't be able to last the night in the rain. To make things worse, I had checked the weather forecast the night before and there was no rain predicted. Guess that just shows how inaccurate weather predictions can be. It was only sprinkling at first, but I knew if it got worse, I'd have to call the whole trip and go home. Of course, it did get worse. It started pouring, and then to make things even worse, thunder and lightning began to crack nearby. So I packed up what little I had and started jogging back to my car through the dark forest, lit only by a dim flashlight and the occasional flash of lightning. Fortunately, I made it back to my parked car relatively quickly. To see anything in front of me, I had to put the windshield wipers on their max setting. I had about 10 to 12 miles on this secluded and narrow 2-lane road in the forest with no street lights before I'd reach a main road. I was only about 2 miles in when I rounded a corner and saw a Subaru with a small trailer parked diagonally across the road. The way it was parked completely blocked my path. I couldn't even go off the road to get around it because there were trees on either side. I wasn't able to see inside the car, so I turned on my high beams. This revealed a man slouched over in the driver's seat, his head resting on the steering wheel. From the looks of it, he was completely unconscious. Just then, lightning struck. The flash revealed another man partially visible in my headlights. He was outside, lying face down in some puddles. He, too, looked unconscious. An immediate sense of unease overwhelmed me. The scene seemed too perfect, a car and its trailer blocking the entire road after an accident, and everyone involved was unconscious. I saw a lot of red flags. I had heard stories of people playing dead in the middle of the road to lure unsuspecting drivers out of their cars for sinister purposes. I decided I wanted no part of this. I began reversing to find a spot where the trees gave me enough room to make a 3-point turn. My eyes kept darting between the rearview mirror and the Subaru. Just as I got back far enough, I turned my head back towards the Subaru one last time, and my blood ran cold. The man in the driver's seat and the man lying on the road were now both running full speed towards my car. Meanwhile, more men were jumping out of the trailer and joining them. There had to be at least 5 or 6 guys all running towards me. I was still completing the turn when they got close enough to start aggressively yanking on the door handles, but I had them locked. I threw the car into drive and barreled out of there. I was forced to take a longer route back home. During that drive, I swear I had my eyes on the rearview mirror, checking to see if I was being followed, more than I had them on the road in front of me. When I finally got home and had a moment to calm down, I called the police. Though they didn't find anyone or even anything matching the descriptions I gave, and I'm not sure if anything will come of it. I didn't get a license plate number, and it was too rainy to make out any facial features. Something I did take note of, though, was that from what I could see, they didn't have any weapons. Instead, they had items like ropes, handcuffs, and tape. You'd think people doing this would just want to rob you, and admittedly, that's probably how it goes for most cases. But I truly believe this time was different. I don't know what they wanted to do, but something tells me it was worse than being robbed. The house I grew up in was very large. My bedroom was on the second floor, and its window overlooked the driveway and neighborhood street it was attached to. At the time, my bed was placed almost right up against this window. I was around 15 or 16 when this happened. Both of my parents were out of town on vacation, and I have no siblings, so I was home alone. As a teen, I tended to stay up late, sometimes doing homework, but often browsing social media or texting friends. It was around 4 a.m. when I was doing just that while lying in bed. It had been raining with occasional distant rumbles of thunder for pretty much the whole night. Being on the second floor, it was. On a hot August night in Florida, a storm raged with extraordinary force. The lightning was so intense it tore through the darkness, and the thunder boomed as if the very earth was shaking with its fury. My 6-year-old son, alarmed by the ominous sounds, jumped up and said, "Let's go outside." Dad, I was somewhat surprised by his insistence, but I followed him nonetheless. We dashed into the pouring rain, getting drenched as we ran to our gazebo. The setup under the gazebo was as usual cozy, with a minibar, wicker sofas, a TV, and a mini fire pit. I turned on the fire pit for warmth and the TV to distract us from the howling wind and deafening thunder. We settled onto the sofas, but I noticed my son was unusually agitated. His eyes were wide open, and he couldn't take his gaze off the darkness outside the gazebo. I remembered how, as a child, I used to love sitting in the rain and listening to the storm, but this time, something felt off. Suddenly, the TV flickered and the screen showed static. We tensed up, but the image returned, and we resumed watching the storm. However, something was wrong. With every flash of lightning, I saw something sinister moving in the shadows, shapes that couldn't be attributed to the storm itself. They moved as if they were watching us, their silhouettes distorted and unnaturally stretched. My son, noticing this, huddled close to me, whispering, "Dad, I see someone out there, in the dark shadows. They're watching us." I tried to reassure him, but the unease persisted. The lightning grew more intense, and with each flash, the same ominous figure became clearer. When I checked the fire pit, it started to flicker out, its warmth vanishing, and at that moment, a thunderclap was so violent it shook the entire gazebo. Moments later, the TV screen again went static, and through the interference, I saw something even more disturbing, a face, twisted into a grotesque grimace, which seemed to whisper words that never reached our ears. Fear engulfed us, and I grabbed my son, determined to leave the gazebo. But as we stepped out into the rain, we felt an eerie sensation. It seemed we were not alone. In the downpour, we noticed shadows trailing us, sliding along the edge of our vision. We were surrounded, and no sound could explain what we saw. As the storm subsided and the rain gradually ceased, all that remained was an inexplicable sense of dread. We returned to the house, and despite the storm's intensity, the night felt especially dark and ominous. We no longer sat outside and watched the storms. That evening remained in our memory as a reminder that even in the most familiar and cozy places, there can be shadows that are best left unspoken.